Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Kaysen, Risk Communications Specialist for the Kentucky Division of Water. I will be your instructor for this educational module titled Understanding Flood Risk. The purpose of this module is to explain what risk is and how flood risks specific to the state of Kentucky can potentially affect its residents. Risk is the potential that a chosen action or activity, including the choice of inaction, will lead to a loss or an undesirable outcome. The notion implies that a choice having an influence on the outcome exists, or existed. Risk can also be defined as future issues that can be avoided or mitigated rather than present problems that must be immediately addressed. Vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of a person, group, society, or system to a risk, such as physical or emotional injury or attack. It's also the extent to which changes could harm a system or to which a community can be affected by the impact of a hazard. The risk assessment in the Kentucky State Enhanced Hazard Mitigation Plan includes an overview of the types of all natural hazards that can affect the state. The state of Kentucky is vulnerable to a wide array of natural hazards which threaten life and property. Through research of the historic impacts, 13 hazards are emphasized in the Kentucky State Hazard Mitigation Plan. The focus of today's lesson will be flooding. Additional modules are available to discuss the other 12 hazards listed. Flooding, which is one of the most significant natural hazards in Kentucky, occurs within the state every year, with several substantial floods occurring annually. Within the last 3 years, 3 presidentially declared flood disasters have resulted in significant damages in over 80 counties across the state. This statistic does not include the spring 2011 floods, which have already been declared a federal disaster. The state contains over 89,000 miles of rivers and streams, 637,000 acres of wetlands, 18 reservoirs over 1,000 acres in size, and almost 230,000 acres of publicly owned lakes and reservoirs. Approximately 300 communities statewide have identified flood-prone areas, and for many of the communities, the economic, social, and physical damage caused by flooding can be severe. Flooding can happen anywhere, but certain areas are especially prone to serious flooding. To help communities understand their risk, flood maps have been created to show the locations of high, moderate to low, and undetermined risk areas. High-risk areas have at least 1% annual chance of flooding, which equates to a 26% chance of flooding over the life of a 30-year mortgage. All homeowners in these areas, shown on the flood maps as zones labeled with the letter A or AE, with mortgages from federally regulated or insured lenders, are required to buy flood insurance. In moderate to low-risk areas, the risk of being flooded is reduced, but not completely removed. These areas, shown on maps as X or shaded X areas, are outside the 1% annual flood risk floodplain areas, so flood insurance isn't required, but it is recommended for all property owners and renters. To identify a community's flood risk in Kentucky, FEMA, in conjunction with the Kentucky Division of Water, conducts a flood insurance study. FEMA uses the data gathered in the flood insurance study to create the flood hazard maps that outline your community's different flood risk areas. Changing weather patterns, erosion, and development can affect floodplain boundaries. FEMA is currently updating and modernizing the nation's flood insurance rate maps. These digital flood hazard maps provide an official depiction of flood hazards for each community and for properties located within it. In addition, FEMA has embarked on the next generation of flood risk identification and communication called Risk Map. Risk Map combines flood risk identification, flood risk assessment, and hazard mitigation planning to provide communities and citizens with a better understanding of their flood risk that will ultimately lead to safer, more sustainable growth. FEMA has published flood insurance rate maps in over 80 Kentucky counties. The remaining counties will have updated flood insurance rate maps in the next year or so. Additionally, Risk Map will provide more intuitive products such as flood depth grids, percent flooding chance over a 30-year mortgage, and areas of mitigation interest. These products will help to better understand flood risk. Thank you for watching this module on the topic of understanding flood risk. The takeaway lessons we hope you will retain are: risk is the potential for an undesirable outcome which can possibly be avoided or mitigated. Vulnerability is the susceptibility to a risk. Kentucky's State Hazard Mitigation Plan has identified 13 hazards or risks, one of which is flooding. Flooding occurs annually in Kentucky's 13 major drainage basins, with 300 communities having identified flood-prone areas. FEMA conducts flood insurance studies to identify risk of flooding and maps this data on a flood insurance rate map. Flood insurance rate maps provide official depictions of flood hazards for each community so citizens can make informed decisions about protecting their property.